It all started on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air is cool and carries the scent of fallen leaves. I was sitting on my porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the mist rise off the fields that my family had worked for generations. The barn stood proudly at the edge of the property, its red paint faded and its wooden beams showing their age. But to me, it was more than just a structure. It was a piece of my heritage. My grandfather had built that barn with his own two hands nearly 70 years ago, long before there was ever talk of homeowners associations or resort communities popping up around our sleepy rural town. That barn had weathered storms, sheltered livestock, and stored hay through countless seasons. It was as much a part of my family's story as the old photographs in my living room. So when the letter from the HOA first arrived, I didn't pay it much mind. It was printed on stiff paper with an officious letterhead, citing some obscure bylaw about property appearances. They called my barn an aesthetic nuisance, said it clashed with the look they wanted to maintain in the area. Apparently, their grand vision for our community didn't include time-worn structures steeped in history. I scoffed and set it aside, thinking surely this was some mistake. After all, my property was on the outskirts, tucked away from the neatly paved roads and manicured lawns of the new resort developments. Surely they wouldn't come after an old barn that had stood there long before the HOA itself even existed. Weeks passed, and more letters came, each escalating in tone. Words like final notice, mandatory compliance, and legal action were sprinkled throughout. It seemed ridiculous, almost laughable, that a committee of people who'd only moved into the area in the last decade could dictate what I did with a structure that had stood on my family's land since the 1950s. I wrote back firmly, explaining the barn's importance, its history, even attaching old black and white photos of my grandfather standing proudly next to it with a team of draft horses. I received no reply, only another notice with an imposed deadline to address the violation. Then one morning, I awoke to the sound of heavy equipment growling outside my window. I rushed out, heart pounding, to see a crew in neon vests and hard hats maneuvering a bulldozer up my gravel driveway. A couple of HOA board members stood off to the side, clipboards in hand, looking smug and self-satisfied. I shouted at them, demanded to know what they thought they were doing. They coolly informed me they had obtained the necessary orders to proceed with the demolition, citing my repeated non-compliance. I tried to stand in front of the barn doors, arms spread wide, hoping maybe my outrage would cause them to hesitate. It didn't. The bulldozer lurched forward, its massive blade biting into the weathered siding. The groan of splintering wood was like a living creature crying out. Dust billowed up, stinging my eyes. Piece by piece, my grandfather's handiwork collapsed in on itself. I stood there, powerless, fists clenched so tightly my knuckles turned white. By the time the machines finally rumbled back down the road, there was nothing left but a heap of shattered beams and crumpled tin roofing. Neighbors came by later, some offering awkward words of sympathy, others just curious to see the wreckage. I barely heard them. I walked slowly around the debris, kicking aside boards, finding a rusted horseshoe that must have hung there for decades. My chest felt hollow. All those memories, gone, reduced to rubble, because a handful of people thought my barn didn't look pretty enough to match their new lakeside vacation homes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table long after the sun had set, running my hands over the rough grain of the wood, thinking of all the family gatherings that barn had witnessed. The laughter, the hard work, the promise of harvests. I thought about my grandfather, how proud he'd been to build something lasting. It struck me then, in the stillness of my kitchen with the smell of dust still clinging to my clothes, that this wasn't just about a building. It was about respect, for history, for family, for the sweat poured into this land. And the HOA had bulldozed all of it like it meant nothing. After the dust settled from the demolition of my barn, I found myself spending countless hours pacing my property, replaying the events over and over in my head. The anger didn't fade with time. If anything, it grew sharper, more insistent. Every time I looked at that flattened patch of dirt where my family's legacy once stood, a fresh wave of bitterness washed over me. I knew I couldn't undo what they'd done, but some part of me was determined to find out just how far their arrogance had stretched. That's when I decided to dig through the old records that my father had carefully stored away in a battered metal filing cabinet in the attic. Among stacks of yellow documents and handwritten notes tied up with twine, I found the original deed to our land. It was a thick bundle of papers, fragile with age, some of them even bearing my grandfather's looping signature. I spent that evening carefully spreading them out on my kitchen table, tracing lines with my finger, following property boundaries and notations written in an old surveyor's hand. That's when something unexpected caught my eye. A narrow strip of land, extending beyond where I'd ever bothered to walk, marked clearly as part of our parcel. At the far end of it, in fading ink, was a note indicating the presence of a dam valve. My mind started racing. I knew there was a small dam at the edge of the big lake that the resort and HOA properties now surrounded. In fact, their entire community was marketed around that sparkling body of water, luxury lakeside homes, boat docks, private beaches. It was their crown jewel. I'd always assumed the dam and the lake were managed by the resort corporation, since they were the ones constantly bragging about it in glossy brochures. But according to these old documents, the key control point, the main valve that regulated water flow out of the lake, sat squarely on my land, under my legal control. The more I read, the more it all started to click into place. Back when my grandfather purchased this property, he hadn't just bought farmland. He had secured rights to the water that ran through it, including the section where the dam valve had been constructed decades ago to help manage irrigation for surrounding farms. Those rights had been quietly passed down through the family, noted only in these aging documents, never contested because for most of our lives, no one cared. The lake had been little more than a functional reservoir then, not the glittering recreational centerpiece it had become. Now it seemed painfully clear that the HOA had either ignored these records or hadn't bothered to look closely at all. In their rush to establish dominance over every aspect of the community, they'd overlooked one very critical detail. They may have built their luxury homes, hosted their fancy summer regattas, and strutted around like they owned every inch of shoreline. But the mechanism that kept their prized lake at optimal levels, that was on my property, under my authority. I sat there at the kitchen table for hours, papers spread around me, feeling a strange mix of vindication and adrenaline. I thought about all the threatening letters they'd sent me, all the smirks from their board members as they watched my barn crumble. They believed they held all the power simply because they had a committee and some bylaws, because they wore matching polo shirts and called themselves a board. But in reality, they'd built their entire idyllic paradise on a foundation they didn't actually control. The next morning, I put on my old work boots and trudged down that overgrown path past where the barn had once stood. Blackberry vines tugged at my jeans, tree branches snagged my shirt, but eventually I pushed through to a small clearing. There, half hidden under a thicket of brush and moss, was a rusted metal hatch with an old iron wheel protruding from it. The main valve. My heart thudded as I crouched down, brushed away leaves, and gave the wheel a tentative turn. It moved, stiffly but surely, proof that decades later, it was still operational. Standing there, the weight of everything sank in. This wasn't just some petty bit of leverage. This was the literal lifeblood of their lake. If that valve were to close, the water level would drop, docks would sit on mud, fish would struggle in the shallows, and the entire community's carefully curated image of lakeside luxury would begin to unravel. I ran my hand along the cold metal, thinking of how my grandfather must have inspected it all those years ago, never imagining it would someday give his grandson the upper hand in a battle neither of us could have predicted. Word traveled fast in our small community, especially when the HOA had something to boast about. It wasn't long after I rediscovered my rights to the dam valve that I started hearing about their latest big event. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes and pinned to bulletin boards at the local diner, glossy invitations promising an exclusive summer celebration on the lake, complete with catered dinners, live music, fireworks, and tours of the fancy new vacation cottages they were so proud of. They wanted to showcase just how picturesque and desirable their lakeside resort had become, hoping to lure in new buyers and investors who would pay top dollar for a slice of their self-styled paradise. I couldn't help but feel a grim sort of satisfaction watching them ramp up preparations. Trucks hauled in tents and portable stages. Workers strung fairy lights along the docks, and rows of white folding chairs were set up on perfectly manicured lawns. Every day I'd pass by and see board members in pastel polo shirts and sun hats, clipboards in hand, barking orders at landscapers to trim hedges and lay down fresh gravel. They were determined to make everything look flawless, right down to the flower arrangements lining the lakeside paths. Meanwhile, I was busy with my own quiet preparations. Every evening I'd walk back to the dam valve, sometimes with a flashlight, sometimes just at dusk when the fireflies came out. I wanted to be sure I understood exactly how it worked, testing how far the wheel would turn, listening to the low groan of old iron shifting, feeling the vibration of water under my feet. It was a strange, almost meditative ritual that steadied my mind and reminded me that all of their bustling activity rested on something they didn't even realize was under my thumb. As the big day approached, the HOA's excitement spilled over into smugness. I ran into one of their board members at the local hardware store, a guy named Carl who never missed a chance to flash his self-important grin. He was there buying last-minute tiki torches for the lakefront party, telling anyone within earshot about the VIP guests flying in from the city and how this was going to put our community on the map in a major way. When he spotted me in the aisle, he gave me a pitying sort of smile, the kind that made it clear he still thought of me as the stubborn old landowner who couldn't keep up with the times. I didn't bother correcting his assumptions. I just let him ramble on, nodding absently while mentally picturing the rusty valve that connected their glittering plans to my unassuming patch of ground. That conversation only made me more resolute. It wasn't about revenge in the cartoonish sense of the word. It was about reminding them that land, history, and quiet stewardship mattered far more than committees and appearances. They had bulldozed my barn without hesitation, dismissing my family's legacy as inconvenient clutter, all to keep their little kingdom looking picture-perfect. Now they were about to find out that appearances didn't hold much water when the literal source of their lake's beauty could be controlled by one person with a hand on a wheel. The morning of the celebration arrived bright and cloudless, the lake sparkling under the sun as boats dotted the water. Music floated across the surface, mingling with laughter and the clink of glasses. I could see clusters of well-dressed visitors touring the new cottages, HOA representatives guiding them along wooden boardwalks with proud gestures toward the lake. A catering crew hustled back and forth from a long buffet, tables stacked high with shrimp cocktails, fruit trays, and tiny frosted cakes. Everything looked so carefully orchestrated, so smugly confident. I stayed on the edge of it all, lingering by my fence line where the grass grew taller and wilder. From there, I watched as Carl and the rest of the board preened and posed for photos, certain they were cementing their legacy as visionaries who had transformed a sleepy lakeside area into a sought-after destination. Children squealed on paddleboards. Older couples lounged under umbrellas with glasses of white wine. Every detail screamed opulence, exclusivity, success. In that moment, the contrast struck me hard. Their pristine celebration set against the quiet persistence of my land's older bones. The earth doesn't forget what's been built on it, no matter how much new landscaping you throw down. Underneath the turf, beneath all their pavilions and walkways, the ground still remembered the hooves of my grandfather's horses, the footprints of farm dogs chasing after kids, the long-ago laughter of barn dances held under lantern light. The HOA could try to pave over that past, but it was still there, layered deep in the soil, waiting for someone willing to stand up and honor it. When the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and rose, the lake seemed to glow even more brilliantly, catching every last bit of light and throwing it back like a mirror. From across the water, I could see lanterns flickering along the docks, music drifting out over the surface, the laughter and chatter growing louder as more guests arrived. Cars lined the gravel roads. Valets in crisp shirts hustled to park them neatly. The HOA board members stood near the welcome arch they'd decorated with fresh flowers, greeting people with wide smiles and confident handshakes. Everything was unfolding exactly as they'd planned. A perfect evening on their perfect lake, except the lake wasn't really theirs. Not the water, not the land under it, not the essential mechanism that kept it all stable. I kept reminding myself of that as I walked the familiar path back through the brush toward the dam valve. With every step, my pulse thrummed a little harder, not from nerves exactly, but from a deep sense of inevitability. It felt like the moment when a storm finally breaks after days of heavy clouds. A necessary release that was always going to come, whether anyone liked it or not. When I reached the old hatch, I crouched down and ran my fingers over the cold iron wheel. Even after weeks of checking and testing it, the sheer age of the thing always made me pause. It had been there long before the HOA's party tents and cocktail tables, and would probably be there long after their resort dreams had faded. I braced myself, took a steadying breath, and began to turn. The valve protested at first, groaning in its housing, then gradually began to rotate. I didn't close it all at once. I wanted it to be slow, deliberate, to give the water time to start its quiet retreat in a way that wouldn't be immediately obvious. As I worked the wheel, I pictured the lake on the other side of the trees. The docks would begin to sink, just a little. The boats tied up in their slips would rest a bit heavier on the ropes. No one would notice right away. They'd still be clinking glasses, still taking selfies by the water's edge, still congratulating each other on how beautifully everything had come together. Meanwhile, inches of water would slip away, sliding out through the hidden spill channels now open below my feet, carrying the glittering reflections of their lanterns downstream. I stayed by the valve for a while, listening. There was a low rumble as water shifted through ancient stonework, like the earth was clearing its throat. A few startled birds took off from nearby branches. Otherwise, everything felt oddly peaceful. I stood there, hands on my hips, staring back toward the faint glow of the party lights beyond the trees. It struck me how little they understood about where they lived. They hosted these grand events, bragged about their lakefront vistas, yet never bothered to learn how the lake truly worked, or who actually controlled the lifeline that kept their little paradise afloat. Eventually, I made my way back up to the clearing near my house, the same patch of ground where my barn once stood. From there, I had a decent view of the distant festivities. A string quartet played by the shoreline, their music carrying sweet and thin through the humid night air. Guests gathered around tall patio heaters, plates balanced in one hand, drinks in the other, oblivious to the slow transformation taking place at their feet. It would take hours before the change became undeniable, before docks began to list at awkward angles, before the water lines etched on the pilings stood stark and dry, before kids noticed their toes squishing into unexpected mud instead of splashing in cool shallows. I could almost imagine the first moment of confusion. Maybe it would be a couple strolling hand in hand to take a romantic photo by the water, only to find their favorite rock oddly exposed. Maybe it would be someone trying to push off in a kayak, puzzled by how shallow it suddenly felt. And eventually, inevitably, word would ripple through the crowd that something wasn't right. That the lake was dropping, not from drought or some natural cause, but because the person they dismissed, pressured, and insulted still held the most important key to their entire show. As the night stretched on, I found myself drifting back toward the edge of my fields, drawn by curiosity and a quiet sort of satisfaction. Even without the barn standing sentinel anymore, I could feel my grandfather's presence, not as a ghost exactly, but as a weight in my chest, a reminder of the years he spent protecting this land, tending to every fence post and patch of soil with a reverence only someone who's truly tied to a place can understand. This wasn't just about payback. It was about restoring a balance they disrupted when they decided that history didn't matter, that they could bulldoze through someone else's roots without consequence. By the next morning, the whispers had already started. I woke up early and took my coffee out onto the porch, savoring the quiet before the day warmed up. From where I sat, the lake was only partially visible through the trees, but even so I could tell something was different. The water didn't catch the light quite the same way. It seemed to have sunk, pulling the shoreline back like a retreating tide. Birds that usually skimmed low over the surface were clustered along muddy patches now exposed, pecking for bugs in places that had been underwater just the day before I finished my coffee slowly, then set off down the familiar trail to see the results firsthand. As I emerged from the tree line, the view of the lake sprawled out in front of me, unmistakably changed. The docks that had looked so pristine and inviting during the party were now canted at odd angles, their support posts sticking awkwardly out of the water. Some small boats had settled into the muck, tilted to one side as though embarrassed to be caught stranded. Here and there, tangles of lakeweed lay exposed to the sun, limp and dark on the fresh mud closer to the resort's main lawn. I could see people gathered in small groups, pointing and talking. A few of the more ambitious guests had ventured out onto the docks, clearly puzzled by how low the water had dropped overnight. Workers in resort uniforms hustled along the boardwalk, cell phones pressed to their ears, wearing the tight, worried expressions of people who suddenly realized they didn't have a plan for this sort of problem. It struck me just how fragile the whole illusion was. All the money they'd poured into building this image of perfect lakeside living, undone by something as simple as a valve turned by hand. I kept my distance, standing under the shade of an old oak while I watched the drama unfold. A maintenance cart zipped by on a gravel path, two men inside, gesturing animatedly toward the lake. I could imagine the frantic calls being made to the HOA president and the resort managers. Urgent conversations filled with speculation and blame. Maybe someone would start digging up property documents, trying to figure out who actually controlled the dam. Maybe they'd already discovered that inconvenient fact and were scrambling to come up with how to manage me into opening it back up. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't about stubbornness or spite. This was about finally having them look beyond their manicured lawns and glossy brochures to see the deeper reality of this place. The land and water were tied together by more than just pretty views. They were part of a living system that had been managed carefully by real people who understood it intimately long before the HOA ever decided to plant their flags here. My family had walked these banks, fished these shallows, repaired fences and culverts after spring floods. We knew this lake as more than a marketing feature. We knew it as a neighbor, sometimes generous, sometimes demanding, but always deserving of respect standing there. I let my gaze wander along the receding shoreline. Small fish flitted through the shallows that remained, darting nervously between exposed roots. Frogs sat in the mud, their throats pulsing. The ecosystem was adjusting in real time, carrying on as it always had, indifferent to human plans for perfect weekend getaways. But the homeowners and guests weren't so adaptable. They'd invested in this place precisely because they believed it would stay frozen in some ideal, unchanging postcard image forever. They hadn't planned for the messy unpredictability of nature, or the stubborn will of someone like me who still held the real keys to the lake's balance. Eventually, a couple of board members ventured close enough for me to overhear their strained conversation. They were arguing quietly, pointing back and forth between the waterline and a tablet one of them was holding, probably loaded up with spreadsheets forecasting property values and maintenance budgets. Even from a distance, I could hear the panic creeping into their voices. The lake was their biggest selling point. Without looking full and sparkling, the illusion fell apart. Investors would balk. Buyers would reconsider. Everything hinged on that blue expanse staying exactly where they wanted it, something they'd taken entirely for granted until today. I turned away after a while, leaving them to puzzle it out on their own. As I walked back up toward my house, the air felt sharper, cleaner somehow. Maybe it was just the faint scent of mud and lakeweed carried on the breeze. Maybe it was the subtle shift of power settling where it had always rightfully belonged. My grandfather would have understood. He'd spent his life knowing that real stewardship meant more than just appearances. It meant remembering that the land could humble anyone who tried to bend it too far to their will. It didn't take long for the HOA to come knocking. By the third day, after the lake had dropped so noticeably that local kids were chasing frogs across stretches of cracked mud, where water used to lap gently at the shore, I saw two SUVs roll up my gravel drive. Out stepped three of the HOA board members, dressed less like confident hosts now and more like anxious salespeople whose commissions had just slipped through their fingers. Their polished shoes picked up dust and grass stains as they made their way to my porch. I stayed seated in my old rocking chair, arms folded across my chest, waiting to see which of them would try speaking first. It was Carl, of course, the same one who'd smirked at me in the hardware store just days before the big celebration. His usual slick grin was gone, replaced by a tense line of forced politeness. He cleared his throat, adjusted the collar of his pastel shirt, and tried to launch into some friendly banter about how beautiful this part of the property always looked in the summer. I let him talk, didn't bother to hide my steady, unblinking stare. It didn't take long for him to run out of small talk. Finally, he got to the point. They were concerned, he said, about the sudden drop in the lake's level. Guests had been complaining, property owners were getting nervous. Even a couple of local newspapers had called to ask questions about why the docks now sat high and dry. He tried to frame it like we were all neighbors, facing an unexpected natural hiccup together. And wouldn't it be best if I could assist the community by ensuring the dam valve remained open to keep the lake healthy and attractive for everyone's benefit? The words were carefully chosen, no doubt rehearsed on the drive over. They danced around the truth that none of this was really about community or nature's health. It was about money, the value of their homes, the resort's reputation, the ongoing stream of rental income from people who wanted that idyllic lakeside backdrop. Without the lake full, everything else started to look a lot less like a luxury getaway and a lot more like a marsh waiting to happen. I didn't interrupt him. I let Carl's speech taper off into uncomfortable silence. One of the other board members, a woman who'd rarely looked my way before, stepped forward with a tight smile and handed me an envelope. Inside was a formal letter offering what they described as a generous compensation package if I would agree to guarantee the lake's levels by keeping the dam valve permanently open. They framed it like a partnership, like I'd be doing them a favor and receiving a tidy sum in gratitude. The figure wasn't insignificant. It might have even tempted someone else, someone without old roots here, someone who hadn't watched their family's barn get torn down by the very people, now asking for a favor. I set the envelope on the small table beside my chair, deliberately slow. Then I leaned back and rocked a few times, letting the wooden slats creak under my weight. The silence stretched. I could see Carl's jaw tightening, the way his hand fidgeted with the button on his cuff. They weren't used to being kept waiting. They were the ones accustomed to issuing ultimatums, sending out violation letters, deciding what did and didn't belong in their vision of the community. Now they found themselves standing in my yard, under my old oak trees, trying to coax cooperation from a man they'd written off as an unpolished holdout. What they didn't grasp was that this land wasn't some passive asset for me to leverage. It was part of my family's bloodline, layered with memories that stretched back generations. That barn they destroyed wasn't just timber and nails. It was harvest dances, hand-carved initials and support beams, the smell of hay after a long day's work. The lake, the dam valve, the marshy inlets and deer trails through the woods. All of it was wrapped together in a living history they tried to steamroll in favor of cocktail parties and brochure photos. Standing on my porch, I realized they were finally seeing a sliver of the cost of ignoring that history. Their resort community was perched on a delicate balance that didn't care about glossy marketing or property assessments. It cared about the flow of water, about the old agreements written into deeds long before any of them thought to build vacation cottages here. And that delicate balance could shift with a simple turn of an iron wheel, something they now fully understood. Judging by the uneasy glances they kept exchanging, I watched them for a while longer, letting the moment weigh heavy in the humid summer air. Eventually they tried again, their voices softer, promises more elaborate. They hinted at future investments, at renovations they could fund that might honor the heritage of the area, dangling new community projects as if I'd be dazzled by brick walkways or little commemorative plaques. They didn't realize those things meant nothing compared to the deep, stubborn pride that ran through me every time I walked these fields, even without the old barn standing guard.